Today we're going to look at one of my favorite little design details that we worked on for the drop-down menus in Catalyst, which is our official React UI kit. Take a look at this demo over here. This is a really simplified version of the actual drop-down menu, but you can get the idea here of how it all works. I'm using React here instead of vanilla HTML for a change, just to keep things a little bit more organized, but I promise you, even if you've never used React in your life, you'll have no problem following along with this at all. So we've got a drop-down menu component here, which is this panel, and then a bunch of drop-down items. And each drop-down item has an icon and a label. So here's the icon, here's the label, just all stacked on top of each other. Now, I think this looks really great as it is right now, but take a look at what happens if, for whatever reason, maybe we didn't have an icon for one of these items. If I comment out this icon, you can see the text jumps all the way over to the left and it's no longer aligned with the text in the other items. To me, I don't know, this is pretty ugly. This is the sort of level of polish I really like to get right in the stuff that I'm working on. So let's take a look at how this is implemented and see how we can go about fixing it. So if we head over to the drop-down file here, you can see the individual drop-down items are implemented just using like a flexbox layout, okay? So it's display flex, item center, and there's a bit of a gap between the icon and the text. So you can understand why removing the icon would cause the text to move over to the left, because now it's the only item in there, so it's just gonna appear at the beginning of the layout. So to fix this, we can refactor this flexbox layout to a grid layout. I'll show you what I mean. So instead of flex here, let's do grid. And for the grid columns, we'll use some custom grid columns here. I'm going to give this first column a size of 4 from Tailwind spacing scale, because that's the size of the icon. And then for the second column, we'll just do 1 FR so that the text can fill all of the remaining space. Now, if we hit save here, nothing should change yet. And that's because we need to explicitly say that the drop-down label should always be rendered in the second column. So if we go down to the label, we can say call start to, and there you go. Now everything's lined up exactly like we wanted it to be. Much better than how it was before. But in my opinion, we're not quite done, because if we head back to this file here, imagine that in this dropdown, none of these items had icons. And maybe you can guess what's about to happen here. Now there's this giant gap on the left-hand side where we've reserved space for an icon, but it's not needed at all because none of the items are actually taking advantage of that space, because none of them have icons. So how do we solve this problem? How do we make sure that we reserve space for an icon if any of the items have icons, but if none of them have icons, we collapse that space? This is actually like quite a tricky problem, and I'm not sure it was even possible to solve this in CSS until very recently, thanks to some very modern CSS features that we're going to talk about as part of this solution. So I think the most important thing to understand here is that for any of this to be possible, we can't make each individual drop-down item its own isolated grid. We're going to need to have some sort of shared global grid that these are all part of so that they can all sort of impact each other and be related to each other in some meaningful way. So I'm going to start by basically like hoisting this grid layout up to the drop-down menu instead. And that's where we'll define our main grid here. So instead of Flexbox, which is what we were using for the drop-down menu, I'm going to delete that stuff, and I'm going to make this a grid layout as well, okay? And for the grid columns, we're going to do this a little bit differently, because here we were setting it to 4 because we wanted to always reserve space for the icon, right? But now we're saying we don't always want to reserve space for the icon. We just want to reserve space if the icon is there. So we can't use spacing 4 here, or there will always be a spot for the icon. Instead, let's use auto. So this will reserve space for an icon if it's there, and it'll take up just the amount of space that it needs. But if nothing's in that column, the column will collapse down, okay? Then for the second column, we're gonna use 1 FR, just like we did before, so the text can fill up the remaining space. Now, in terms of gap, I don't think we actually want a gap here, because think about it. If there's no icon, that first column is going to be empty, and then you'd have a gap, and then you'd have the text. So you'd still have some extra space. We don't want that. We only want the gap if there's an icon. So I think we're gonna have to handle that gap a little bit differently. We'll get to that soon. So let's just hit save here, see what happens. Okay, things are very broken. The reason for this is because each drop-down item, which is a single A tag, needs to span both of these columns we've defined, right? Because right now the first drop-down item is going into the auto column, the second one's going into the 1FR column, the next one's going into the auto column in the next row, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's start by just doing something like call span 2, and that should get us a little bit closer, okay? But you can see here we're still reserving all this space for the icons. How are we gonna handle this? Each one of these is still its own independent grid. They're not like contributing to this grid. And this is a challenging thing to solve because normally with grid, things need to be like direct children of the grid to contribute to the grid. And the grid in this case is this drop-down menu, but the direct children are the drop-down items that are each spanning 2 columns. So how are we even gonna make this work? How can we make this drop-down icon here be part of the first column defined by the drop-down menu and the drop-down label be part of the second column defined by the drop-down menu? Well, we can do this with a very modern CSS feature called subgrid, which will basically let us take this individual element and sort of make it like a transparent pass-through element where these elements can be sort of treated as the direct children of this actual grid. It'll probably be easier to understand if I just use it and show you what happens. So we'll keep this defined as a grid, but instead of using grid calls with this custom grid, we're gonna say grid calls subgrid, okay? Now what this tells it to do is basically inherit the parent grid and take the children and have those contribute to the parent grid. Basically act as if the children of this item are the direct children of this item, okay? So you can already see that that moved everything over exactly the way that we wanted because there's nothing in that auto column. Now check out what happens if I bring back one of the icons. Oh my goodness, everything moved into the right place. Magical. But I bet if we open the DevTools here, we're going to see a little detail that's maybe not quite perfect yet. Let's select this thing. Okay, so see how we still have that gap there, this gap that I was telling you about before? If we go ahead and get rid of this icon, I bet you that gap is still in there. Yeah, see how there's that purple gap there? And it's actually partially overlapping part of the label too, which is not really what we want at all there, just because of how things are being condensed. So let's get rid of this gap because we only want there to be space if an icon is actually present. And now we should see that, okay, as expected, this label goes all the way to the edge. And instead of using grid gap to define the space between the icon and the label, let's bake the spacing right into the icon. So the icon is sort of in charge of adding that space. If it's present, it creates the space. We can do that by just adding a right margin. So I'm just gonna do MR2 here. And now see how nothing changed at all? So nothing moved, which is good. But when we go back here and bring back the icon, the gap is still there. And we can verify that with DevTools. You can see that gap right there. If I go in here and select the individual icon span, yep, there's the gap. So now we can bring back all of the icons and things are gonna look exactly the way that we expect. And if we get rid of an individual icon, all of the text still stays lined up. And if we go back to the way we just had it, where all of the icons are gone, we're not wasting any space and all the text lines up to the left. Really, really cool trick. A CSS subgrid is one of those features that's very difficult to wrap your head around in my experience, but once you use it once to solve a real problem, you start to wonder how you ever got anything done without it. And you start to see opportunities to use it in all sorts of interesting places. So I hope you check out the code for this one and play with it and start trying to think about where you might be able to use subgrid to solve problems in your own projects. Because in my opinion, it's a major unlock in terms of what we're able to do in the browser almost at the same level that things like Flexbox and Grid were in the first place. Really lets you do some powerful declarative stuff with pure CSS that you needed to use JavaScript and stuff for in the past. So check it out, CSS Subgrid, awesome tool.